we've got a responsibility where we're at in our own homes right now, to help our neighbors, where our churches are located, help those who are living around our churches with physical needs that they have. Some of them are going to need some help, again, going to the doctor, need some help with food. And you have to think your church was planted where it was for a reason. And that's your part of the wall that you need to build up. And if every church just built up the part of the wall closest to their buildings, and if each home built up the part of the wall closest to their home, we would not only survive this period, but I can see a revival. I can see people wanting to be a part of whatever this movement is that has gotten us excited and thinking outwardly about others. When all this is said and done, what will be written in the books about the church? Will it be that we survived, or that we became a home to those who are in exile? Yeah, well, I'll begin by saying this is, of course, a new reality. Our generation has never experienced anything quite like this. I think everybody is being directly or indirectly affected by this pandemic, whether you are one of the individuals in that demographic that is particularly vulnerable to the disease and may very well suffer dramatically from it, or whether you are in the working class and you are worried about whether you'll have a job because businesses are not opening like they normally do, or whether you are a child who attends a public school and are used to getting those daily lunches that are not coming. Everybody's being directly affected or indirectly affected by this right now, and we're just beginning to see the effects of it. So when I think about this from a biblical perspective, and since I'm always looking at things through the Old Testament lens, I think this is most like the exile that Israel experienced. And the exile didn't come all at once. And I think that's something that's a little bit scary as we think about what might lie ahead for us. The exile came in waves. Beginning in 605, we're told that Nebuchadnezzar was really frustrated with Jerusalem for not holding up its end of the deal to pay tribute and tax. And so Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem. He besieged it. He tried to get Jehoiakim on board, but he wouldn't be gotten on board. And so he was taken into captivity and was subjugated there. Then you have 597, Jehoiakim did the same thing. So Nebuchadnezzar returns, hoping maybe he can still keep this slave state alive. He takes away some of the richest people, along with Ezekiel, into captivity. And then finally in 586, he realizes Jerusalem is just not going to be obedient. He comes in, he sacks the city, destroys the temple, all the palaces. He takes Zedekiah into exile and makes him watch his sons be slaughtered before his eyes, then puts out his eyes and probably kills him later on in captivity. And three prophets who experience all three phases of those exiles in order are Daniel, then Ezekiel, and finally Jeremiah. Now, I want to focus on Daniel, though I'm going to hint a little bit on what Ezekiel and Jeremiah have to teach us. But when Daniel was handpicked to stay alive during this captivity, he probably didn't know what he was getting into, but he, along with his friend Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, experienced this captivity in the palace of the king. And I think there's some similarities here because although the temple was still around in 605, not being near it and not being near their local community in Jerusalem, but rather being surrounded by unfaithful to Yahweh Babylonians, made it very difficult for them to keep their faith. But one of the things I take away from reading Daniel at this time is that everything Daniel does during this time of uncertainty is what he always did. So in chapter 1, for example, he's given a new diet, and rather than giving in to that new diet, he does what he always did. He eats the clean food of vegetables and water. And I know right now our concern for purity is more biological, which was not the case for Israel. They weren't as concerned about clean and unclean foods because of health reasons. They weren't as concerned about mold in the home and leprosy for health reasons. But I think there are still some parallels there in what they were concerned about and what we are being concerned about today. But I just love how it says in chapter 1, around verse 8, that Daniel had purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's food. He'd already made up his mind what he was going to do during this time of captivity, and he actually held up on that. He does the same thing later on when he's told he can't pray. I think that's something we're all doing more of right now. He instead of giving into that edict where he can't pray to the king or to any god for that month, it says he did what he always did. He went to his rooftop. He faced toward the temple, which for us might be our church building. It might be toward heaven, might be going outside on a mountain or going near water or a tree, but facing toward that place of security and safety. And he prayed like he always did. And I think right now our prayers may sound a little different. Maybe they should sound a little bit different. We're praying for our own health. We're praying for the health of our families, praying for the health of the whole world right now. I would say if that's where you're at, I would encourage you to take that next step and pray with fasting. Pray that God will remove this disease from the face of the earth and throw it into the sea. If you already pray with fasting, pray with somebody else. Maybe call a family member or a friend on the phone and pray together. Some of our neighbors are going to try this Sunday to gather together to sing, because that's one thing we're missing from the live worship services is getting to have congregational singing. So we'll be, separated out, but we'll be near enough to each other we can benefit from one another's singing. So being in exile makes us be creative. And later on, when the temple is finally destroyed and they don't have that to hold on to, we find that many of the biblical figures are replacing temple worship and sacrifices with good deeds and almsgiving and prayer, of course. And the heroes that rise through all of that in the intertestamental period are Daniel and Esther, and more stories of them circulate as people think about the faith of these individuals through all of this. And maybe one more story I'll pull from Daniel. Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are minor characters in chapter 1, but they're hinted at. And they end up doing what Daniel does. When Daniel says that he's not going to eat the king's food or drink the king's drink, but instead he wants to be tested with vegetables and water for 10 days, we're told that his friends follow his lead, that they do exactly what he did. I think we need to be mindful of this right now, that whether we're the father or mother in our home, or whether we're a boss or whoever we might be, our reaction is influencing those around us in tremendous ways. And later on, Nebuchadnezzar's anger will cause his servants to die in the flames of the fire rather than the 3 men he wants to die in the fire. And so our reaction can have a huge impact on those around us. And then in that same story, we find that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are unwilling to bow down to that image. Though I think the implication is that everybody else, all the other Jews, are bowing down out of fear that they might die. Is a real message for us right now, because I think it's easy to be afraid. It's easy to live in our shelters, to not know about tomorrow, and I think some of that's natural and normal. But I don't think we should stay there. I don't think we should live in fear. I think this is really an opportunity for the church to act like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and say, it doesn't matter what happens to us, we will never bow down to, in this case, fear. But we will be bold and confident and hope-filled. And I said this to our church this past week, that if there's been an opportunity that we've been waiting for, we've been going to Bible class for, we've been studying for, it's right now. It's right now when the church can really shine in hope and peace, while others might be in living in chaos. And it is surprising to me that, at least the little social media I do, there seems to be a lot of hope and peace out there. And so I wonder if the church can project something even more than that, something of a next steps, because I think more is coming. Which takes us to Ezekiel. Ezekiel's primary goal in coming in 597, speaking to his fellow Babylonians, was because they were complacent. They thought the worst had already come, that going to captivity was it. And he says, no, the temple is going to be destroyed in a few years, and more of your friends and family are going to be joining. And so, what Ezekiel has to do is he has to give the bad news that this is only the first wave. There's more to come. And while they don't necessarily accept Ezekiel's message on the surface, and while Ezekiel's message is really pointed toward those who are responsible for the exile, which is not a direct equivalent to what we're facing today. I wouldn't necessarily say what we're facing today is a judgment for what any one person or group of people have done. I think there is a lesson to be learned that there may be more to come, maybe more in the coming weeks, months, or years. And so it is important that we not become complacent, that we are prepared for that next step as a church to respond to our neighbors who may be suffering physically, who may need us to go to the grocery store for them and bring them some food, people who might need to be taken to the doctor, people who right now want to retire, but their retirement account is cut in half, and they're going to have to work harder and longer. And so we don't know what the next step's going to be. But as Christians, we have hope and peace and faith that no matter what happens, God's going to take care of us, and he's going to take care of the world through us. But that's what we need to do right now, is be preparing, like Joseph, setting aside, maybe during this small amount of break before I think more may very well come, so we can take care of those around us when the famine might continue. And then the final story is Jeremiah's story. Jeremiah actually experiences the destruction of the temple in 586. He's the weeping prophet who could do nothing but cry for the people as they suffer, and he suffers alongside with them. And then he's taken down to Egypt, where he probably died. But the whole time he's telling King Zedekiah that he needs to give in. He needs to live in this new normal. They need to give in to the Babylonians and go and live in that land, get married, have kids, which Jeremiah himself can't do. God told him to be celibate. But they're supposed to build new homes. They're supposed to live new lives. I think maybe the message from Jeremiah for us today is to try to find a new normal right now, to continue to pray for our nation and all the nations of the world, to continue to go on with life as best we can, but not to give up on what the ultimate goal is, which for Jeremiah would be the restoration of all these things that would one day come. When we get to the latter part of the story of the Old Testament, which actually takes place in the middle of the Old Testament canon, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, we learn from Esther how to take care of the vulnerable during a time of chaos, because she's okay, but no one else will be okay if she doesn't stand up and do something for everybody else. And so if you're that person today, you're doing okay. You may have to cancel a vacation or two, but you still know where your food's coming from. It may be that you, like Esther, are being called for such a time as this to take care of those who may be concerned about their basic needs and their survival, their life. And then Ezra and Nehemiah live in a time in between Esther, or around Esther, I should say. Ezra, then Nehemiah, where back in Jerusalem, they're trying to rebuild a broken society. Ezra's primary mission is to restore their understanding of Scripture. They had gone so long without Torah that they didn't know that in marrying these foreign wives and in failing to honor the temple and the way it's supposed to be used, and the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, was contrary to God's law. So Ezra was sent by the king of Persia. From Ezra's perspective, it was to offer hope and peace through Christ, or through God at that time. And so what Ezra does is he reads Scripture to them for an entire day, from morning until evening. They stand up and they listen to it. I can only imagine what it would feel like to be standing all day long listening to Scripture. But when you don't have Scripture and you hear it fresh for the first time, it can be very engaging and get you listening intently. So as they listen, moms and dads and kids all together, Ezra's reading Scripture, and the Levites are going out explaining Scripture to the people, and even the kids are able to learn from this. The message is that what you have been failing to do can now be done. You can turn back to God. You can be saved. And so they began to look at what they need to do during that time. This is where Nehemiah comes in, because Nehemiah says that part of the calamity was his fault and the previous generation's fault. And so he prays. He prays for whatever they did to contribute to the problem. And then he says, we've got to fix the problem. And he comes prepared to rebuild the city, not just physically with a wall, but also spiritually and communally. And I think that's where we might learn our greatest parallel from these stories for us today, is we've got a responsibility where we're at in our own homes right now to help our neighbors, where our churches are located, to help those who are living around our churches with the physical needs that they have. Some of them are going to need some help, again, going to the doctor, need some help with food. And you have to think your church was planted where it was for a reason. And that's your part of the wall that you need to build up. And if every church just built up the part of the wall closest to their buildings, and if each home built up the part of the wall closest to their home, we would not only survive this period, but I can see a revival. I can see people wanting to be a part of whatever this movement is that has gotten us excited and thinking outwardly about others. When all this is said and done, what will be written in the books about the church? Will it be that we survived, or that we became a home to those who are in exile? I think that's really our challenge right now, is we've been preparing for something. I think this is the time that we deploy our resources and our hope and our peace and help others. So the way I envision this working is, I think the first thing we all are doing in our churches is trying to maintain a little bit of normalcy. So we keep our worship services streaming. And I think that's wonderful and good. So I can imagine Sundays being devoted to kind of keeping people connected to one another in worship. And then I can see Mondays and Tuesdays being spent caring for the saints of your church, making sure that your older members who may be particularly susceptible are being cared for, making sure widows and orphans, making sure children are getting food. Monday and Tuesday, take care of your own saints. But then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, maybe even Saturday can be a time to reach out to the community, to look beyond just caring for ourselves, and looking and seeing what resources we can deploy to those around our church, around our homes, those within our sphere of influence. I think if every Christian does that, if every Christian community does that, that we will not only survive this, but this will be a time where people will not be talking about Red Cross, they won't be talking about Walmart, they won't be talking about what the government did, they'll be talking about what the church did to rebuild the walls of the world.